Merry Christmas.
It was the night before Christmas vacation, and the McCallister house was as chaotic as ever. The family was preparing for their trip to Paris, and the excitement was infectious, filling every room with a whirlwind of activity. Amidst the rush of packing suitcases, checking passports, and ordering pizzas, 8-year-old Kevin McCallister felt invisible. His older siblings teased him, his parents ignored him, and he was left feeling like the odd one and out. The chaos around Kevin didn't just overwhelm him, it made him feel like he was in the way, a burden. He tried to speak up, but his voice was drowned out by the noise of the house. No one seemed to care that he was there. Not his older brother Buzz, who took every opportunity to pick on him, or his parents, who were too busy making sure everything was packed and ready for the flight. "I wish you all would just disappear," Kevin muttered under his breath, after Buzz stole his slice of pizza, throwing him a smug grin. Buzz's tormenting always got under his skin, but tonight it felt worse than usual. It was as though the entire family had turned against him. Kevin stormed out of the kitchen, making his way to the basement to get away from everyone. The basement was dark and cold, a place Kevin usually avoided, but tonight he wanted to be alone. As he sat down on an old, creaky chair, his anger still simmering, he didn't notice the small spider crawling up the wall behind him. It wasn't just any spider, it was something much more sinister. Earlier that day, a radioactive spider had escaped from a research lab on the outskirts of the city. It had traveled through vents and cracks, making its way into the McCallister home, where it now found itself in the dark corners of the basement. Kevin rubbed his eyes, trying to push the anger away, when he suddenly felt a sharp pain on the back of his neck. "Ow!" Kevin yelped, slapping his hand against his neck. He felt something small and squishy under his palm. A spider. He flung it to the ground in disgust, watching as it scuttled away into the shadows. "Great. Just great," he muttered, rubbing his neck where the bite still stung. The moment passed, and Kevin returned upstairs, trying to avoid his family for the rest of the night. But as he lay in bed later that evening, something began to feel off. His body ached in ways he couldn't explain, and his senses were on overdrive. The sounds of the house seemed louder, clearer. He could hear the creak of every floorboard, the wind rattling the windows, even the hum of the refrigerator downstairs. His body felt strangely light. His muscles tingled with a newfound energy, though he didn't understand why. Kevin tossed and turned, unable to sleep, his mind racing with confusion and frustration. What had happened to him? Why did he feel so different? Kevin woke the next morning to find the house eerily quiet. No shouting, no clattering of dishes, no arguments over who had to take a shower first. He sat up in bed, blinking in confusion. Something wasn't right. He hurried downstairs, only to discover that his wish had somehow come true. His family was gone. The entire McCallister house was empty. At first, Kevin was overjoyed. "I made my family disappear," he exclaimed, running around the house in excitement. He jumped on beds, ate ice cream for breakfast, and watched all the movies he wasn't allowed to watch. It was the ultimate dream for an 8-year-old left alone. But as the initial excitement faded, Kevin began to notice that something else had changed too. Something even more startling than his family's sudden absence. As he sat on the living room floor, flicking through channels on the TV, he reached for the remote, and suddenly his hand stuck to it. Kevin's eyes widened as he tried to pull his hand free, only to find it glued to the remote. He tugged harder, and with a loud pop, his hand came loose, sending the remote flying across the room. He scrambled to his feet, his heart racing. "What the heck?" he whispered to himself, staring at his hand as if it belonged to someone else. Suddenly, A sharp sensation buzzed through his body. An instinct. Kevin spun around just as a lamp teetered on the edge of the table, falling toward him. Without thinking, he shot his hand out, and to his shock, a thin strand of webbing shot from his wrist, catching the lamp mid-fall. Kevin gasped, staring at the sticky web attached to his hand. He gave it a slight tug, and the lamp swung back into place. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what just happened. This can't be real. But it was real. Kevin rushed to the hallway mirror, inspecting his reflection. He raised his hands, his fingers trembling slightly, and then, with a flick of his wrist, more webbing shot out, attaching to the ceiling. Kevin's heart pounded in his chest. It was like something out of the comics, like Spider-Man. But he wasn't a superhero, he was just a kid with spider powers. Kevin spent the next few hours testing his abilities in secret. He discovered that he could climb walls, leap from one side of the room to the other, and shoot webs with surprising accuracy. His strength had increased too. He lifted a chair with one hand as if it weighed nothing. But as thrilling as his powers were, Kevin still had no idea what to do with them. All he knew was that his family was gone, and now he was left to figure out these strange new abilities on his own. Kevin's newfound powers were about to be put to the test sooner than he thought. As he explored the house, still reveling in his strange abilities, two shadowy figures crept closer to the McCallister home. Harry and Marv, known as the Wet Bandits, had been casing the neighborhood looking for homes left empty by families on vacation. They hadn't expected anyone to be left behind, least of all a kid with superpowers. That evening, as Kevin sat in the living room, watching A Christmas Carol on TV, his spider sense tingled for the first time. It was a strange, almost buzzing feeling at the back of his mind, like an invisible hand pushing him toward danger. Kevin froze, his eyes darting to the window. He saw two men skulking in the shadows, sneaking toward the back door. His heart leapt into his throat. He recognized them, Harry and Marv, the same crooks he had seen earlier pretending to be police officers. They were coming for him. Kevin panicked for a moment, his mind racing. Normally, he would have set up his traps, his go-to method for dealing with intruders. But this time, something inside him told him to use his powers instead. He wasn't just the defenseless kid they thought he was. He was something more now. Harry and Marv crept through the back door, their flashlights flickering across the darkened kitchen. "The place is empty," Marv whispered, his voice filled with glee. "We're in." Kevin, hiding on the ceiling above them, watched with wide eyes as the Wet Bandits began rummaging through drawers and cabinets, looking for valuables. His spider sense tingled again, urging him to act. He dropped from the ceiling, landing silently behind them. Before either of the burglars could react, Kevin shot a web from his wrist, snatching Marv's flashlight and yanking it away. "What the?" Marv spun around, eyes wide with confusion. Kevin stood there, webbing clinging to his hands. "You guys picked the wrong house," he said, trying to sound braver than he felt. Harry sneered, stepping forward. "What's a kid gonna do? We're not scared of you." But before Harry could take another step, Kevin leapt into the air, landing on the wall behind them. The sight of the boy clinging to the wall like a spider sent shivers down the burglars' spines. "Holy, did you see that?" Marv yelled, stumbling back in fear. "The kid's a freaking monster." Kevin grinned. "You don't know the half of it." With a flick of his wrist, Kevin shot a web at Harry's legs, tripping him and sending him crashing to the floor. Marv panicked, grabbed a nearby broom, and swung it wildly. But Kevin was too fast. He ducked under the swing, shooting another web that snatched the broom out of Marv's hands and sent him tumbling into a pile of holiday decorations. Harry tried to get up, but Kevin was too quick, wrapping him in webbing and pinning him to the wall. The wet bandits, now terrified, struggled against the sticky webs, their eyes wide with fear. "Let us go, kid, what the hell are you?" Harry screamed, his voice filled with desperation. Kevin stood over them, his chest heaving, his heart racing. For the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of the bad guys. He had the power to stop them, and it felt good. But as the police arrived, summoned by a silent alarm, Kevin couldn't shake the feeling that these powers were more than just a game. He was different now, changed, and he would have to figure out what that meant soon. As Harry and Marv were hauled away by the cops, Kevin stood alone in the McCallister house looking down at his hands. The webs still clung to his fingers, a reminder of what he had become. A year had passed since Kevin McCallister's first encounter with the wet bandits, and things had changed. After the incident, Kevin continued to keep his spider powers a secret, not wanting to alarm his family or friends. He wasn't sure what to do with them. He wasn't Spider-Man after all. He was just a kid, but the feeling of responsibility weighed heavily on him. He couldn't forget the look of terror on Harry and Marv's faces when they had been webbed up, nor could he forget the thrill that came with using his powers to protect his home. Now, a year later, the McCallister family was planning another Christmas trip, this time to New York City. Kevin, still grappling with the idea of being a kid with superpowers, hoped this trip would be normal. But he couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was never far away. It was Christmas Eve, and once again the chaotic McCallister household was buzzing with excitement. Kevin had tried to stay under the radar, not wanting to repeat last year's disaster. He packed quietly, keeping to himself as his siblings squabbled and his parents rushed around the house. But as the family prepared to leave for the airport, Kevin felt a strange tingling in the back of his mind, his spider sense. It wasn't strong, just a faint buzz, but it was enough to make him pause. Something was off, but he brushed it aside, chalking it up to nerves. After all, what were the chances that anything bad could happen on a family trip to New York? But the McCallisters being the McCallisters, disaster struck again. In the chaos of getting through the airport, Kevin got separated from his family. He followed the wrong man, mistaking him for his dad, and before he knew it, he had boarded a plane to New York City while his family flew off to Florida. As the plane took off, Kevin realized he was alone, again. But unlike last time, he didn't panic. If anything, he felt a sense of déjà vu. Maybe, he thought, this time he could handle it. Little did Kevin know Harry and Marv were about to re-enter his life in a much more dangerous way. Meanwhile, in a prison outside Chicago, Harry and Marv had been plotting their revenge for months. The humiliation of being captured by an 8-year-old still stung, but it wasn't just about the embarrassment anymore. They wanted payback, and they wanted it bad. Harry, the more cunning of the two, had spent his time in prison carefully planning their escape, and now the moment had come. During a routine transport, Harry and Marv managed to overpower the guards, making a daring getaway in the dead of night. The wet bandits were free, and they had one goal in mind: finding the kid who had ruined their lives. "This time, we're not just gonna rob him," Harry growled as they sped away in a stolen car. "We're gonna make him pay." Marv, still bitter about being webbed up and left for the police, nodded eagerly. "I want to see the look on his face when we get him. We'll take everything from him." Their escape went unnoticed by most, but as fate would have it, they soon learned that the McCallisters were headed to New York. It wasn't hard to put the pieces together. Harry and Marv had done their homework. They knew where the family was staying, and this time, they weren't just after valuables. They wanted revenge on Kevin, and they didn't care who got in their way. Kevin arrived in New York with wide-eyed excitement. The towering buildings, bustling streets, and dazzling lights of the city felt like a dream come true. With his dad's credit card in hand, which he had accidentally grabbed, Kevin checked into the luxurious Plaza Hotel, thrilled at the thought of spending Christmas in the city on his own. He spent the next day exploring Central Park, visiting toy stores, and enjoying the freedom of being in New York without any parental supervision. But all the while, his spider sense buzzed intermittently, as if warning him of something just beyond his reach. Kevin tried to ignore it, focusing on the fun of being in New York, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. And then, everything changed. That night, Kevin returned to his hotel room to find something that shook him to his core. A message on the television screen about a robbery that had taken place at Duncan's Toy Chest, one of the city's most famous toy stores. The camera footage showed two familiar faces, Harry and Marv, breaking into the store and robbing it blind. Kevin's heart raced as he recognized the wet bandits. They were in New York, and they were after him. But that wasn't the worst of it. As the news report continued, Kevin's blood ran cold. The reporter went on to say that Kevin's family, who had been scheduled to arrive in New York the following day, had been attacked. Harry and Marv had found out where the McCallisters were staying, and in a horrific act of vengeance, they had broken into the family's hotel room, killing Kevin's parents in cold blood. The news report flashed images of the crime scene, the room torn apart, and police officers escorting the remaining McCallister children to safety. Kevin stood frozen in the hotel room, his hands trembling as the reality of what had happened sank in. His parents were dead, killed by the very same criminals he had humiliated a year ago. And it was all because of him. Tears filled Kevin's eyes as he collapsed onto the bed, his mind racing. This was no longer a game. The wet bandits weren't just burglars, they were murderers. And now they were coming for him. For the first time since discovering his powers, Kevin felt truly lost. He had always thought of his spider abilities as something fun, something that made him special. But now, he realized the weight of the responsibility that came with them. He had the power to stop Harry and Marv before, but he had let them go. And now his parents were dead because of it. Kevin spent the next few hours in a haze of grief and guilt, replaying the events of the past year over and over in his mind. He had the power to stop them, but he had failed. And now, the wet bandits were still out there, and they wouldn't stop until they found him. As the night wore on, Kevin knew he couldn't hide forever. He had to do something. But what could an 8-year-old kid do against two hardened criminals? That's when Kevin remembered Spider-Man, the comic book hero who had lost his uncle because he hadn't acted in time. Kevin had read the story 1,000 times, but now it felt more personal than ever. Like Spider-Man, Kevin had been given powers that he didn't fully understand. But unlike Spider-Man, he had never embraced them. Maybe it was time to change that. Determined to make things right, Kevin wiped away his tears and headed out into the snowy streets of New York. His heart pounded in his chest as he made his way to a small costume shop he had passed earlier that day. Inside, he found what he was looking for: a red and blue Spider-Man suit hanging on a rack. It wasn't the real deal, just a cheap knockoff meant for kids, but Kevin didn't care. He grabbed it along with a black mask to cover his face, and paid with the money he had left from his dad's credit card. Standing in the alley outside the shop, Kevin pulled on the suit, the fabric stretching awkwardly over his small frame. It didn't fit perfectly, but it didn't have to. As he slipped the mask over his face, Kevin looked at his reflection in the store window. He wasn't just Kevin McCallister anymore. He was something more, something stronger. He was Spider-Man. With his new identity solidified, Kevin swung through the streets of New York, his webs allowing him to move faster than ever before. His spider sense guided him, and he soon found himself standing outside Duncan's toy chest, the very store that Harry and Marv had just robbed. The building was dark, but Kevin's enhanced senses could hear the faint sounds of movement inside. The wet bandits were still there, counting their loot, completely unaware that their worst nightmare had just arrived. Kevin climbed the side of the building, using his webs to pull himself up to the second floor window. He peered inside, his heart racing as he spotted Harry and Marv below, sorting through bags of stolen toys and money. This time, it's not about toys, Kevin whispered to himself. This time, it's personal. With a deep breath, Kevin shot a web at the window latch, silently opening it. He slipped inside, moving quietly along the ceiling, his eyes locked on the two criminals below. His spider sense buzzed with anticipation. This was his chance to stop them once and for all. As he positioned himself directly above them, Kevin prepared for the confrontation that would change his life forever. Kevin crouched silently on the ceiling of Duncan's toy chest, his heart pounding in his chest as he watched Harry and Marv below. The wet bandits, completely oblivious to the danger lurking above them, were laughing and counting their stolen money, their voices echoing in the empty store. Kevin's mind was racing, filled with anger and grief. His parents were dead because of these two men. They had stolen his childhood, turned his Christmas into a nightmare. This time, it wasn't about outsmarting them with pranks and traps. This time, he had the power to stop them, once and for all. Slowly, Kevin lowered himself from the ceiling, his webbing silent as it stretched toward the floor. He landed just a few feet behind Harry, who was busy stuffing bills into a sack. Kevin's fist clenched, his heart burning with rage as he stepped forward. "Harry, Marv," Kevin's voice rang out sharp and cold. Both men jumped, spinning around to see the small figure standing in the shadows. For a moment, neither of them recognized him. The cheap Spider-Man suit and black mask made Kevin look like a completely different person. But then Marv's face twisted in shock. "It's the kid," Marv stammered, backing away. "It's that kid, but what's with the costume?" Harry sneered, pulling out a gun from his coat pocket. "You should have stayed down, kid. We were done with you. But now, we're gonna finish what we started." Kevin's spider sense flared as he saw the gun. His muscles tensed, and without thinking, he shot a web at the gun, yanking it out of Harry's hand and sending it clattering across the floor. Harry cursed under his breath, his eyes narrowing in frustration. "Not this time," Kevin said, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You took everything from me, and now I'm gonna make sure you never hurt anyone again." Marv, still reeling from the shock, picked up a crowbar and swung it wildly at Kevin. But Kevin's reflexes were too fast. He flipped backward, dodging the blow with ease. The adrenaline coursing through his veins was electric, his senses sharper than ever. Every movement felt precise, calculated. Kevin landed a solid punch to Marv's gut, sending him staggering back into a shelf of toys. Marv groaned, clutching his stomach, his face twisted in pain. "What the hell are you, kid?" he wheezed, gasping for breath. Kevin didn't answer. His focus shifted to Harry, who lunged at him with a snarl. The fight was brutal, more violent than anything Kevin had ever experienced. This wasn't a game anymore. This was life or death. Harry swung a fist at Kevin, but he dodged effortlessly, delivering a powerful kick that sent Harry crashing into a display of Christmas decorations. Glass shattered around him as he hit the ground, but Harry quickly scrambled to his feet, grabbing the gun from the floor. Kevin's spider sense tingled, warning him of the danger before Harry even had the chance to aim. Without hesitation, Kevin shot a web at the gun, yanking it upward just as Harry pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, deafening in the quiet store. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. Kevin's heart stopped as he watched the bullet fly through the air. But it wasn't aimed at him, it was aimed at Marv. The bullet struck Marv squarely in the face. Marv's eyes went wide with shock, his hands flying to his head as he stumbled backward. Blood poured from the wound, and he crumpled to the floor, dead before he even hit the ground. Kevin stood frozen, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he stared at Marv's lifeless body. He hadn't meant for this to happen. He hadn't wanted anyone to die. But now, Marv was dead, and it was because of him. Harry, his face twisted in fury, lunged at Kevin with a roar. But this time, Kevin didn't hold back. The rage that had been simmering inside him erupted, and he attacked Harry with everything he had. Kevin punched Harry in the face, again and again, each blow harder than the last. His fists were shaking, his vision blurred by anger and grief. He could hear Harry's bones crack under the force of his punches, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Harry tried to fight back, but Kevin's strength was overwhelming. Blood splattered across the floor as Kevin beat him to the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The world around him faded, and all that was left was the sound of Harry's labored breathing and the thud of Kevin's fists. But then, something inside Kevin snapped. He looked down at Harry's broken, bleeding body, and for the first time he saw what he had become. This wasn't justice. This wasn't what Spider-Man stood for. He was supposed to be better than this. Kevin's fists trembled as he backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. Harry lay on the ground, barely conscious, blood dripping from his face. I can't do this, Kevin whispered, his voice hoarse. He took a step back, tears filling his eyes. This isn't who I am. He turned and ran, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. He didn't stop running until he reached Central Park, the cold winter air biting at his skin as he collapsed onto a bench. His entire body ached, and his mind was a whirlwind of guilt and regret. Kevin sat in Central Park for what felt like hours, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. He had defeated Harry and Marv, but at what cost? Marv was dead, Harry was barely alive, and Kevin was left with the knowledge that he had almost killed someone in his rage. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, Kevin finally stood up, his legs shaky. He had to go back to the hotel to figure out what to do next, but as he made his way through the park, his mind still buzzing with everything that had happened, a voice called out to him. Kevin? Kevin froze, his heart skipping a beat. He turned to see Buzz standing at the edge of the park, his face pale and his eyes wide with shock. "What are you doing out here?" Buzz asked, his voice trembling. "And what's with the costume?" Kevin's blood ran cold. He hadn't realized he was still wearing the Spider-Man suit. His brother, the last person he wanted to see him like this, stood there staring at him like he was some kind of alien. Kevin opened his mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. Buzz took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "Wait a minute. You're Spider-Man?" Kevin's face flushed with embarrassment. He pulled off the black mask, revealing his tear-streaked face. "I didn't want anyone to know," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. It's complicated." Buzz was silent for a long moment, his eyes scanning Kevin from head to toe. Then, to Kevin's surprise, Buzz let out a low whistle. "So, you're the kid that took down Harry and Marv with superpowers?" Kevin nodded, still unsure of what to say. He had expected Buzz to mock him, to tease him mercilessly like he always did, but instead Buzz's expression softened. "Kevin, I had no idea," Buzz said, his voice quieter than usual. "I mean, I always thought you were kind of a wimp, but you're like a real superhero." Kevin stared at him confused. "A superhero? Buzz, I almost killed someone. This isn't This isn't what I thought it would be. Buzz frowned, scratching the back of his head. Yeah, but you stopped them, right? You did what no one else could do. I mean, look, I'm not good at this kind of stuff, but if I had powers like you, I don't know if I could have done it. You're braver than I thought. Kevin was silent, the weight of Buzz's words sinking in. He had never thought of himself as brave. He had only done what he thought was right, even if he had gone too far. Buzz, sensing Kevin's inner turmoil, awkwardly patted his brother on the shoulder. Hey, come on, let's get back to the hotel. You look like you could use some rest. And maybe some waffles. Kevin managed a small smile, grateful for the unexpected kindness from his usually obnoxious older brother. As they walked back to the hotel together, Kevin couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. He had made mistakes, but he had also learned something important. With great power came great responsibility, and he still had a lot to figure out. It was Christmas morning, and the McCallister family had gathered in the hotel lobby, trying to make the best of the holiday, despite everything that had happened. The wet bandits were behind bars, and Kevin's secret was safe, for now. As Kevin sat by the giant Christmas tree in the lobby, watching his family unwrap presents, he felt a strange mix of emotions. The events of the past few days had changed him. He wasn't just the kid who set traps for burglars anymore. He was something more. But with that power came the responsibility to use it wisely. Buzz walked over, handing Kevin a small wrapped gift. Hey, I got this for you, he said, looking awkwardly at the ground. Kevin unwrapped the present to find a small Spider-Man figurine inside. He looked up at Buzz, surprised. Buzz shrugged. Figured you could use a reminder of who you are. And you're not alone, Kev. You've got us. Even me. Kevin smiled, clutching the figurine tightly. Maybe Buzz was right. He didn't have to do this alone. As the family celebrated Christmas, Kevin looked out the window, the snow falling softly over the city. He knew that his journey was far from over, but for the first time he felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Because now, Kevin McCallister wasn't just a kid left home alone. He was Spider-Man, and he had learned the hard way what it meant to be a hero.